The attack on Pearl Harbor, 1941. By the early 1940s, the Empire of Japan was rapidly expanding. By now, they had either wholly or partially taken control of Korea, Manchuria, and French Indochina, which is now Vietnam, along with many other islands and lands. The Japanese wanted to continue their expansion, however, the United States saw them as an increasing threat. Because of this, the U.S. placed an embargo on Japan, one that would hurt their chances at further expansion. Vehemently opposed to these restrictions, the Japanese planned a surprise attack on the United States in retaliation of the embargo, one that would destroy a large piece of their naval and air power in the Pacific. The Japanese had picked their target, Pearl Harbor, on the island of Oahu in the then U.S. territory of Hawaii. The attack would only be considered a success if the Americans were caught totally by surprise. On the 26th of November 1941, the Japanese force left for Pearl Harbor. Led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the Japanese fleet consisted of aircraft carriers, battleships, and submarines. Eventually, after over a week of travel, the Japanese force arrived about 230 miles north of the island of Oahu. At 6 a.m. on the 7th of December 1941, over 180 Japanese attack aircraft began their voyage to Pearl Harbor, after taking off from the several aircraft carriers as part of the first wave of attack. The second wave of attackers would take off over an hour later at 7:15 a.m., this time consisting of around 160 planes. Many of the troops at Pearl Harbor were relaxing and not obviously expecting a surprise attack. The first wave of attackers had arrived at 7:55 a.m. The Japanese were hoping that there would be significant ships at Pearl Harbor, like aircraft carriers, but this was not the case. There were, however, 8 battleships at the base. These ships consisted of the Arizona, which was hit by a bomb that pierced the upper deck and landed in the ammunition supply, which detonated, causing an enormous explosion. This sank the Arizona and killed nearly 1,200. The Oklahoma was hit by torpedoes before sinking and killing over 400. The Nevada, which was beached and eventually repaired to some extent. The Tennessee, which wasn't badly damaged and repaired in only a few months. The California, which sunk but was repaired by 1944. The Maryland, which was damaged and repaired within a few months. The West Virginia, which sank but rebuilt by 1944, and finally the Pennsylvania, which was in the process of being repaired and was not badly damaged. The only other battleship in the U.S. Pacific Fleet was the Colorado, but was not at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December. The Japanese also targeted the airfields and aircraft in Oahu. The Japanese were mostly successful here, as the planes were easy to pick off as they were just out in the open. Many of the U.S. soldiers at the airfields were unable to effectively combat the Japanese, as many supplies were destroyed. However, some managed to fight back on the ground, and even fewer in the air. In total, nearly 350 planes were either damaged or destroyed. Just under 2 hours after the attack began, the Japanese forces left Pearl Harbor to head back to their aircraft carriers. They arrived and left back to their empire by the early afternoon. The U.S. as a whole was understandably outraged and wanted to strike back. The following day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered the infamy speech, where he is noted for saying,
"Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan."
At the end of the speech, President Roosevelt asked Congress whether or not they wanted to declare war on the Empire of Japan. All but one person voted yes. This officially brought the sleeping giant United States of America into the Second World War. In total, over 2,300 U.S. military personnel were killed in the attack, while an additional over 1,100 were injured. There were around 100 civilian casualties as well. The Japanese just lost around 30 aircraft and some submarines. The United States of America was left a damaged nation, both physically and emotionally. The losses suffered at Pearl Harbor were some that really shook the country. In hindsight, bringing the U.S. into the war was a mistake for the Japanese, as they were able to change the war, ending the Empire of Japan, as well as having a big hand in ending fascism in Europe. Thanks for watching.